Tales on TuneIn Talk Radio isn't available right now.
As she looked into his face, anger and worry clouded her heart. It wasn't so much the thought of him sharing his bed with another woman that troubled her, but the prospect of their beloved daughter being raised by some unknown stepmother. As the king turned to dispose of the soiled cloth, she caught his arm. She whispered in a weak voice, "When I am gone, your courtiers will want you to marry again." The king began to shake his head. Katerina smiled and said, "You may not want to think of it now, but it's true. I will not ask you to remain unwed, but when you do marry, I have one request." The king took her cold hands and insisted that he would do anything. Tears sprang to Katerina's eyes as she told him that he must find a woman wiser and more beautiful than she ever was. The king stared at her in surprise. Then he nodded tearfully and vowed to honor her request. Katerina gave a deep sigh. She could die now, knowing that her husband would always remain faithful to her. No woman in the world could hope to match that description. I'm Vanessa Richardson. You're listening to Tales, a Parcast original. Every Wednesday, we dive into the dark origins of another fairy tale. You can find all episodes of Tales and all other Parcast originals for free on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. To stream Tales for free on Spotify, just open the app and type Tales in the search bar. The tales on this podcast are dark, sometimes scary, and full of adult themes. As a warning, the original story of Donkeyskin features incest, mutilation, and abuse. Please exercise caution for children under 13. At Parcast, we're grateful for you, our listeners. You allow us to do what we love. Let us know how we're doing. Reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast and Twitter at Parcast Network. Today we'll be telling the story of Donkeyskin, the tale of a beautiful French princess who escapes the terror of incest and abuse through hard work and perseverance. Donkeyskin was first published in 1694 by Charles Perrault, a French aristocrat who's often cited as the architect of the European fairy tale. His Tales from Past Times contains many stories that have endured through the centuries, including Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, and Puss in Boots. Perrault adapted all of his stories from older fables, but he always altered them to his taste. He was a devout Christian and wanted the stories he told to reflect his sense of morality. Often the older tales he was drawing from were the product of centuries of oral storytelling and did not contain any straightforward or discernible moral lesson, and so he often had to graft a lesson onto the existing narrative. In crafting the plot of Donkeyskin, Perrault drew heavily on two Italian compilations, and Giambattista Basile's Pentamerone, published in 1634. He also wove in recognizable elements from early French folktales. While Perrault's Donkeyskin was a unique creation, it retains far more of its original source material than his other stories. What results is a tale that simultaneously matches the shape and moral grounding of a late medieval fairy tale, while retaining elements culled from generations of storytelling tradition. It's a dark, strange story that combines fantastical elements with an uncompromising, bleak worldview. It also features one of the most detestable villains in fairy tale history. Marie wrung her hands as she hurried toward the throne room. Her father did not often call on her, so when he did, it made her exceedingly nervous. Once he'd been a kind and caring man, but now, in the years since her mother had died, he'd become cold and distant. Marie rarely saw him and had been raised mostly by her godmother, Claudette. Claudette had been a close friend of Marie's mother. She lived in a grotto near the sea, and the villagers often whispered about her supernatural abilities. Marie did not mind that her godmother was a fairy. She was just glad that she had someone she could trust. As she pushed open the great gilded doors of the throne room, she saw that her father was already seated on the dais. He was surrounded by courtiers and advisors. All of them bore the same uncomfortable grimace on their faces. Only the king was smiling. Marie gave a quick curtsy as one of the king's advisors stepped forward. The advisor said, "As you know, the king has searched long and hard for a woman who could replace your late mother." Marie did know. For the past few years, she'd watched as countless noblewomen and princesses had been paraded before her father. He had sent every one of them away. He always found some fault. One had large feet. One ate too noisily. As the search went on, he grew more volatile and difficult. He'd often lash out at his courtiers for failing to find him a suitable match. But now the advisor adjusted his spectacles and told Marie that her father had finally found someone he believed would fit the bill. Marie smiled uneasily. Something about the advisor's tone made her apprehensive. She said, "How wonderful, my lord. Who is she?" Her father smiled widely, rising to his feet. He replied, "Why, it's you, my dear." Marie tried to laugh, but it came out as a humorless bark. This had to be some kind of terrible jest, but her father was coming toward her. He said, "As I have watched you grow into a woman, my love for you has changed from the love of a father to that of a husband. For a long time, I abstained from expressing my feelings, but once I realized that you were the only one who could live up to your mother's standard, I consulted with my advisors. They agreed that this marriage was truly fated to be." He stood in front of her now, his arms held out as if to embrace her. Marie felt sick. A lead weight had suddenly formed in her stomach. Her mind raced, desperately trying to come up with the right words, a polite but firm refusal. Instead, she took a step back, screamed at the top of her lungs, and fell down in a dead faint. When Marie awoke, she found that she was laying on a bench in the castle gatehouse. For a moment, she just gazed up at the carved stone ceiling above her. She wished she could go back to yesterday, to before her father had revealed himself to be a monster. But that was impossible. She had to face her situation. Marie sat up to see her maids gathered around her. One of the women offered a damp cloth for her forehead, but Marie waved it away. The maids were her father's subjects, and so there was no trusting them anymore. There was only one person whose help she could rely on now. Marie stood up from the bench and asked one of the maids to fetch her horse. The maid furrowed her brow in concern, saying that they were supposed to take the princess back to her father. Marie's heart began to beat wildly. She feared that she was about to become a prisoner in her own home. She stood up straight and spoke in her most regal voice. "Am I not still the princess? You shall do as I say and fetch my horse. Once I've taken a ride to clear my head, then I will go see my father." She gazed fiercely into the maid's eyes. The maid's cheeks burned red. She turned around and barked at one of the others to fetch the princess's horse. Marie smiled. She did not know how, but with her godmother's help, she would find a way to escape her father's advances. When she reached the sea, Marie descended from her horse and tied him to a tree. She patted his chestnut mane and ducked beneath a curtain of vines that hung in front of the entrance to her godmother's grotto. The walls of the cavern were carved from pink and purple coral and lined floor to ceiling with rows of pearls. Marie called out for her godmother. A woman in a flowing gown of shimmering pink silk emerged from the back of the cavern. Marie ran to her. She flung her arms around her godmother's neck and collapsed in sobs. Wiping away her tears, Marie explained what had happened. Claudette brushed her golden hair away from her face and told her not to worry. She immediately began to hatch a plan. Marie was to tell the king that she would marry him, but that first she must have a dowry. He must make her 3 dresses, one the blue of a midsummer sky, one that shines like the sun, and a third that shimmers like the moon and stars. While he made the dresses, Marie would have time to find him a suitable bride. Marie frowned. She wondered what would happen if she couldn't find a bride in time. Claudette leaned into her and spoke in a low voice. "Listen closely, child, for I will tell you the king's greatest secret. In his stables, your father keeps a donkey that is like no other in the world. Whenever the donkey defecates, instead of dung, it produces nuggets of pure gold." Marie's eyes widened in disbelief, but her godmother continued. "This donkey is the king's most prized possession. If your father can make the dresses before you find him a bride, then ask him to slay the donkey and make you a coat from its skin. This he will certainly not agree to. In this way, you can delay the wedding indefinitely." Marie embraced her godmother once more and left the grotto. She mounted her horse and headed for the castle, ready to face her father once again. Coming up, Marie presents the king with her demands. Hi listeners, Parcast has teamed up with the co-hosts from the hit podcast Morbid to bring you the next big thing in true crime and podcasts and countdowns. It's called Crime Countdown, and you can hear new episodes every Monday. Here's Ash and Elena to tell you more.
Hi, I'm Ash. And I'm Elena, and we're hosting the new Parcast original series, Crime Countdown.
Ever wonder who the worst serial killer was?
How about the creepiest cult?
Or which is the coldest of all cold cases?
Well, Parcast thinks you deserve answers.
Or at least some passionate opinions, and they even listed us and the Parcast research gods to get to the bottom of things.
Every Monday on Crime Countdown, we'll discuss 10 unsettling true crime stories centered around a common theme.
We'll try to shock, surprise, and one-up each other, debating each case and its ranking with just a hint of humor.
We can't help it!
Episode topics range from the off-putting to the offbeat and include the top 10 fatal romances, the top 10 Zodiac killer theories, and even the top 10 stolen body parts.
We may not always agree,
and we may not be experts.
But that's what the research gods are for. Follow our new series, Crime Countdown, free on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
Now back to the story. When Princess Marie learned that her father intended to marry her, she wanted to tell him that she would never agree to such a hideous act. Unfortunately, he was the king, and she knew as well as any that he usually got his way. That was why she'd gone to visit her godmother Claudette to ask for help. Claudette instructed her to ask for 3 marvelous dresses in order to delay the marriage. Meanwhile, Marie would search for a more suitable bride for her father. When Marie arrived back at the castle, the king demanded to know where she'd been. She sank into a deep curtsy, bowing her head so she wouldn't have to look at him as she spoke. "Father, I apologize for having collapsed earlier. I was so overcome with emotion at the prospect of being your wife. I wanted to clear my head, so I went for a ride. I understand now that I am indeed the only woman you can marry in order to fulfill my mother's dying wish. Before I am to marry you, though, I would ask for 3 gifts befitting a woman of my stature." Her father smiled with relief. He assured her that whatever she wanted, he would be happy to oblige. Marie explained about the 3 gowns, and her father laughed. "Is that all?" he asked. "A simple task. I will call the finest tailors in the land and set them to work. Any one of them whose work is not up to my expectations will hang." He smiled at her, and Marie's stomach sank. Suddenly, she felt that her godmother's advice had been terribly naive. As soon as she left the throne room, Marie made for the palace aviary. Over the years, there'd been 4 women who had come closer than any others to meeting her mother's standard. Now, Marie wrote out 4 notes, stating that her father was willing to reconsider their offers of marriage. She then tied the notes to the legs of 4 carrier pigeons and sent them off. As she lay in bed that night, she thought that perhaps her father did not really want to marry her, but was only desperate to find a queen for the kingdom. But then she remembered the lecherous look she'd seen in the king's eyes. The next day, Marie's father called her to the throne room again. He was smiling broadly as he directed the 3 dressmakers out from behind a gilded screen. The first held up a dress of blue silk. When Marie looked at it, she felt as though she were truly looking at the infinite expanse of a blue summer sky. The fabric rippled with the most exquisite shade of blue she had ever seen. The next dress to come out was made of golden silk, but the fabric was hardly visible beneath the rubies and garnets. The dress shone so brightly that Marie felt she could barely look at it. Yet despite the weight of the jewels, the silk seemed to flow like water beneath her fingers. Third was the moon dress, and it was the loveliest of all. The fabric shimmered like nothing on earth, and a constellation of diamonds spilled out across the breast. Marie had never seen anything so beautiful in her life, and it broke her heart. She had no idea how her father had managed to complete all 3 dresses so quickly, but it didn't matter. The letters she'd sent would never reach the 4 princesses in time. She had to stall her father. The king gave her a look that made her skin crawl. He asked what she thought of the dresses. Marie paused as she ran her fingers over one of the diamonds on the moon dress. "They're just as I asked, but all last night I thought about my dowry. I realized that something was missing. I should like a fur coat as well." The king opened his mouth to speak, but she interrupted him. "And I would not want it to be just any fur. It must be something immensely valuable. A coat from the skin of your magical donkey." The king's jaw dropped. He tilted his head and looked at her curiously. When she looked back at him, his eyes flashed with rage. He grabbed Marie's wrists and dragged her toward the door. She gave a scream of protest, but the king ignored her. When they reached the stables, he took a key from his belt, unlocked the door, and threw Marie inside. Moments later, Marie stood before the ugliest donkey she had ever seen. It had massive, crooked, yellow teeth that looked like filthy fingernails. Its coarse, dung-colored fur was matted and filthy. She looked down and saw that the floor of the stable room was littered with nuggets of gold. Her father drew a dagger from a sheath around his waist. In a single, quick movement, he ran the knife across the donkey's neck, slitting its throat. Marie was startled as warm blood sprayed from the wound, flecking her clothes and face. The king's burning eyes bored into her as he said, My tailors will make the coat tonight, and we will be married in the morning. No more requests. Your dowry is complete." Just as he had promised, the king sent Marie the donkey-skin coat that very evening. She clutched it in her hands and wept. If she stayed at the palace even a day longer, then she would have no choice but to marry her father. Marie had spent virtually her entire life in the castle. The world outside had always seemed frightening and dark. But whatever monsters it had to offer, she knew they could not compare to the one that now resided in her own home. That night, the princess lay awake in her bed, listening until the sounds of wedding preparations had died down. Once she could be sure that even the lowliest servants were fast asleep, Marie slipped out of bed. She gathered up the 3 dresses and put them into an old wool bag. She donned the donkey skin as a disguise and crawled out the window. She dropped down from the windowsill onto a pile of earth just below. She then snuck out past the sleeping guard and onto the road that led away from the castle. The donkey skin made it difficult for her to move quickly, but she did not dare take it off for fear of being recognized. When she heard the distant baying of hounds, her heart sank. Someone must have awoken and seen that she was gone. Marie had seen what those dogs could do to an animal. She had to find some way to throw them off her scent. She glanced at the river. A recent storm had turned the normally quiet brook into a raging torrent of muddy rainwater. She could see the light of faraway torches and hear the distant shouting of the men who held them. Marie took a deep breath and started down the muddy riverbank. By the time she reached the water, her donkey skin coat was soaked and filthy. She looked back at the palace. Lights twinkled in the windows, reminding her of her big, comfortable bed with its warm, dry covers. Perhaps she could go back. Perhaps comfort was worth putting up with her father. No, she could not allow herself to become his bride. She took a deep breath and dove into the ice-cold river. Several weeks later, Marie found herself in a distant kingdom, sitting in the shadow of a town square fountain. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with one hand and held out the other to passers-by. If she was lucky, some generous soul would take pity and offer her a crust of bread. If not, she would go hungry again. She'd been traveling for weeks, trudging through forests and fields, and occasionally stopping in villages to beg for food. She slept on the ground, and whenever anyone looked in her direction, she pulled her donkey skin down over her face. Though her life had become cold, hard, and lonely, she didn't regret her decision to flee. A young woman walked past her, and Marie cried out, "Please, madam, spare a crust of bread." The woman looked down at her in disgust. She replied that she had no bread to give away, but if Marie was willing to work, her farm was in need of a scullery maid. Marie brightened and told the girl she would be more than happy to work for food and board. The woman, whose name was Louise, brought Marie to a small farm where she introduced her to her mother, Amy. The older woman took one look at Marie and remarked that she'd never seen such an ugly child in all her life. But she agreed to let Marie stay if she would help in the kitchens and keep out of sight. Louise looked at her haughtily, remarking, "This happens to be the very same farm where our good king keeps his royal aviary. I wouldn't want him to stumble across the likes of you." Marie spent her days scrubbing pans and emptying chamber pots. The other servants either avoided or outright mocked her, calling her Donkeyskin after her strange coat. Her only respite came on Sundays when she would retire to the drafty little shed where she slept. There, in the privacy of her own room, Marie would wash herself and change into her 3 dresses. Standing in front of a mirror, she would remind herself that beneath all the layers of grime and dirt, she was still a princess. It was on one of these Sundays that she first laid eyes on Prince Philippe. She was on her way back to the farmhouse when she spotted him riding through the fields. She'd heard about the royal family who ruled her new home and kept their birds on the farm, but she'd never seen any of them before now. Marie darted behind a hay bale and watched as he alighted from his horse and walked toward the farmhouse. He had a thick mane of dark curls, and his eyes sparkled with youth. She heaved a great sigh as she watched him pause and take a drink from a wineskin that hung from his hip. There was something so enchanting about his face. Marie felt she could have gazed at him forever. When the prince neared her hiding spot, Marie pulled the donkey skin down over her face. He walked right past without even noticing that she was there. Marie sighed as she watched him depart. Perhaps when she was a princess she could have hoped for a man like that, but no longer. Now she was just Donkeyskin. Coming up, the prince notices Marie. Now back to the story. After her father decided to make her his bride, Princess Marie ran away from home, disguised in a filthy donkey skin. She made her way to a distant kingdom where she found work as a scullery maid at a farmhouse. While the work was difficult and dull, Marie was satisfied just to be away from her father, until the day the prince wandered into her yard. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. That wasn't particularly surprising. It was a Sunday and a feast day as well. He supposed everyone was in the town square enjoying the food and games. Just to be sure, he opened the door and poked his head inside, calling out to ask if anyone was home. He was greeted with an empty silence. Suddenly, Philippe was seized with the odd urge to explore. He'd never been inside a commoner's home before, and he found the simple building strangely enchanting. He wandered about from room to room, inspecting the meager furnishings and possessions of the absent inhabitants. Each door he tried swung open easily, and he would peek inside before moving to the next one. Finally, he came to the little door at the end of the hall. Where the rest of the house was made of large oak planks, this door was made of flimsy birch wood. It looked as though it had been added on later, perhaps a storage closet or a woodshed. He tried to open it, but the door was locked. How funny, he thought, that every room in the house should be left unlocked except for this one. So Philippe put his eye to the keyhole and looked into the little room. He had to stifle a gasp, for standing inside the little room was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She had skin like a rose petal, delicate features, and long golden hair. She was wearing the most marvelous dress he had ever seen. It shone like the sun and was embroidered all over with exquisite jewels. He was about to knock on the door when he stopped himself. Perhaps she would be angry at him for spying on her, or worse, she might be frightened. He wanted desperately to speak with her, but he wrenched himself away. He would find an opportunity to meet this young beauty, but this could not be it. The next day, Marie stared in shock at Amy, the mistress of the house. In an incredulous whisper, she asked why on earth the prince would want her to bake him a cake. Amy shrugged. She said, "I have no idea. All I know is that a messenger arrived this morning saying that Prince Philippe requested a cake from the girl who lives in the shed." Marie felt her stomach tighten. She was almost certain that the prince hadn't seen her when he wandered through the yard the other day, but what reason could he have for wanting a cake from her? Before she could ask any more questions, the old woman slapped her hand and told her to get baking. She would not have a servant girl humiliating her family. Marie set off for the kitchen. She pulled out flour, honey, milk, and eggs and set to work. As she did, she worried about the prince's strange request. Suppose he had seen through her disguise and somehow realized who she was. Maybe he would deliver her back into the hands of her father. Marie chewed her lip as she stirred the batter. She was so preoccupied that she didn't even notice when her mother's ring slipped off her finger and fell into the cake pan. Philippe received his cake the next day. It was a lovely little pastry topped with a pink swirl of delicate icing. He'd never tasted anything quite like it. He gobbled it up in less than a minute, but as he bit down on the last scrumptious morsel, he felt something metal between his teeth. He reached into his mouth and pulled out a ring. It was finely crafted, a gold band set with 2 emeralds and a diamond. He held it up to the light and saw that it must be worth a fortune. Philippe's heart jumped into his throat. This ring had to belong to the woman he saw in the shed. He asked after the girl who lived there, but was told that the only creature to inhabit that shed was a filthy servant girl named Donkeyskin. The prince was confounded by this. He briefly considered asking this Donkeyskin character about the beautiful woman he had seen, but the other servants insisted that she was practically half beast and didn't even know how to speak. So he'd requested she make him a cake, thinking that it might give him an opportunity to befriend the servant girl, and that she might lead him to the beauty he had seen earlier. He had been right. Through luck or providence, he had received this ring, and now it was his only clue to the mysterious woman's identity. It would have to be enough. Marie whistled a tune as she carried the headless body of a chicken toward the kitchen. She was in a good mood today. Everyone in town and at the farm had been buzzing about the prince's decree. He had ordered that all the eligible ladies in the kingdom be brought to his palace to try on a special ring. Whoever it fit would be his bride. Marie didn't dare try on the ring. She feared that once the prince saw who she was, the lowly Donkeyskin, then he would decide not to marry her and instead give her back to her father. As Marie neared the kitchen, she heard a terrible shriek. She dropped the chicken and ran toward the door. Flinging it open, she saw what had made the sound. Louise, the woman who had given her employment, was sitting on a wooden stool, shrieking hysterically. Her mother, Amy, stood beside her, holding a bloody knife. Marie's gaze traveled down from the knife to the butcher's block, where Louise's left hand sat limply in a pool of blood. Marie gasped in horror when she saw that sitting next to it were several long, thin strips of skin. Marie felt sick. In a small, horrified voice, she asked, "What have you done?" Amy smiled sickeningly and said, "Nothing you wouldn't have done yourself if you'd thought of it first. My daughter and I both tried on the prince's ring, but our fingers were too big. We've resized them, and once they've healed a bit, we'll go again. A little bit of pain is nothing to sacrifice for a lifetime of royal comforts." Louise looked down at the ground, her eyes brimming with tears. Marie's mind was racing. She'd been happy that the prince was thinking of her, but she'd never imagined anything like this could happen. Amy had said they both tried to make their hands smaller. Marie looked to the older woman's hand and felt her stomach churn. The skin on her ring finger was puckered and shiny. Parts of it were raw and bleeding. Sitting on a nearby wooden table, she saw a jar of lye with little bits of flesh floating in it. Marie stumbled backwards out of the kitchen and into the yard, where she vomited into a nearby pig trough. Wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, she knew what she had to do. She had to put a stop to this at once. When Marie reached the palace, the guards led her directly to the throne room, where a line of women were waiting to try on the ring. Marie pulled her donkey skin lower over her head. It had been a long time since she'd been in such magnificent surroundings. She actually felt a bit uncomfortable. As soon as Marie stepped into the line, she heard derisive giggles. The women standing around her thought it was funny that someone so poor and filthy was trying to marry the prince. Marie paid them no mind. She stood up straight and waited patiently for her turn to try on the ring. Once at the front of the line, she held out her hand to the magistrate, who made a face and rolled his eyes. But when he slipped the ring onto her finger, all the laughter stopped. The people who had been mocking her only seconds before gazed at Marie in disbelief. Behind her, Marie heard the door of the hall opening. She spun around to see the prince staring at her in wonder. Marie smiled and held up her hand. She said, "Your search has ended." She dropped her donkey skin cloak to the ground, and a collective gasp went around the room. Underneath her donkey skin, Marie wore the dress that shimmered like the moon. Her luminous golden hair spilled out over her shoulders, and she looked more beautiful than ever. The prince went to her side and took her hand. He looked deeply into her eyes and whispered, "It is you." A few weeks later, they were married. Royalty and dignitaries from all the surrounding kingdoms were invited to the wedding, including the bride's father and her fairy godmother. When Marie saw her fairy godmother, the two women embraced. Claudette sobbed and begged Marie to forgive her. Marie wiped away her tears and told her godmother not to worry. "All's well that ends well," she said with a smile. Marie then turned to her father, who stood waiting behind Claudette. His features were twisted in a grimace of rage. Marie had been thinking about this moment for a long time. She worried she wouldn't be brave enough to look him in the eye, but now that he stood in front of her, she wasn't afraid anymore. She said, "I forgive you, Father." He said nothing in return. Marie walked away to rejoin her new husband, certain that she would never have anything to fear from the old man again. The story of Donkeyskin has been retold countless times since it was originally penned by Charles Perrault in 1694. Around the turn of the 20th century, stories of this kind saw a resurgence. One was published by Joseph Jacobs in 1893, and another by Andrew Lang in 1900 in his Grey Fairy book. Jacobs' version of the tale is titled Catskin, and if you're interested in hearing more about it, we've covered it in another episode of Tales. Both of these adaptations sanitize the story by completely removing the themes of incest. This was undoubtedly a choice intended to placate the delicate sensibilities of a Victorian audience. Though many popular folklore anthologies were collected by men, the original sources were usually women. Mothers told the tales to their children as a way of warning them about the realities of life. In the case of Donkeyskin, the harsh reality of life as a woman in medieval society is on stark display. Our heroine is a victim of unchecked abuse. The king's advisors see that his designs on his daughter are unnatural and yet do nothing to stop it. Even the girl's fairy godmother is too blinded by her faith in society and the system she lives in to truly help. To a certain degree, her inability to affect the outcome of the story parallels the role of the storyteller. The godmother and the storyteller are both doing their best to protect the young women in their lives against a world that they're powerless to change. In the end, Perrault's sensibilities demand a meaningful conclusion and a moral lesson. Donkeyskin comes to the realization that she has no choice but to help herself. Because she is resilient, hardworking, and humble enough to wear the donkey skin, she finds the salvation of a socially acceptable marriage. For modern audiences, Perrault's ending arguably reflects the same kind naivete that the godmother shows in the beginning. It suggests that embracing the values of domesticity is the path to happily ever after, when of course today we might hope for a better future for our heroine.